Some time ago, I posted a tutorial that showed how to create tank treads by simply taking a NURBS curve or a NURBS cylinder and creating follicles on it, and then basically attaching the tread plates to the follicles, and then taking the entire cylinder and enveloping it inside of a lattice, and basically then bending the lattice down into the tread so you can basically rotate the cylinder itself and create your tread easily, and basically no need to assign expressions to every single tread plate, or in the case of using the curve version of it, to every motion path node that's attaching the individual parts of the tread. So the way the tread works basically is you have a NURBS curve, which is basically at the heart of the tread. And then you have whatever type of geometry they're going to use to create the individual pieces of the tread that are basically going to attach to the curve by being encased in essentially a motion path node. Okay, so that when you actually translate the control that's driving your tread through space, it actually doesn't rotate the curve, but it actually drives the motion path nodes from one end of the curve to the other relative to the initial location that each one's been assigned. So each curve essentially has a range of 0 to 1. And so beyond 1, that motion stops unless you set up the expression that controls it properly. And I'm basically just going to go through and show you how to set up the object on the path, and then how to basically create the looping motion. Now, while I did find it easier to create the tread using the cylinder within the lattice, just because you can just simply rotate it and don't have to add the expression nodes and expression to each node, basically it's a lot less parts and you get a really nice result. It is actually much cleaner to just have the treads move around the surface of the object. So what I did is I actually combined the two. I took some aspects of the motion path setup and applied it to a NURBS version of it, where you actually use the NURBS cylinder still, and you can actually still use the lattice to shape it into the tread. However, in this case, instead of applying an expression to multiple motion path nodes, all you have to do is you create the follicles and you apply the expression to the follicles. Also, given the ribbon version of this, you don't have to worry about having an aim object to essentially stabilize your tread so it doesn't wobble. So it's one less part, it's actually a lot less parts, a little less to worry about. Okay, so to begin your NURBS ribbon tread, all you have to do is you're going to go to the Create menu, choose NURBS primitives, and first you need to create a NURBS cylinder. And so when you create your cylinder, you can either go to the Create NURBS primitives menu, go to Cylinder, go to the option box, and it'll bring up your NURBS cylinder options. And then you can actually specify essentially the number of sections around it. So by default, it's usually 8. You could just create it and then go into your input history in the channels box. So you go to Make NURBS Cylinder, and then under there you can specify more sections. So basically the number of sections you're going to specify is going to be however many tread plates you want to actually have in your tread. Okay, so in this case, let's say we did 20. Okay, and then you could either scale the thickness of your tread down a little bit, because we want to make this so that it's basically not too noticeable, although there are a couple of easy ways to make sure that the tread ribbon won't render once it's actually created. So we can just make it thinner by adjusting the height ratio or by scaling it down, and then you can rotate it 90 degrees so it's actually consistent with the orientation of your model. And so I'll just pull it above 0. You can make adjustments to it later, doesn't really matter, but I'll pull it up right now. And so let's say that's going to be the default position for it. Now you can either start shaping it to look like your tread right now, so you could just take it from your right view and then edit the vertices and reshape it. But when you're reshaping, you want to make sure that you try and maintain more or less an equal distance between all of the spans so that your tread plates will equally distribute around the surface as well. So that's going to be true whether you're doing the strictly simplified version of it or this more advanced version of it, because it does ultimately matter with the way it actually looks when you're done. Okay, so now you have your cylinder and you've got your 20 different spans. So now you need to actually create follicles around it. And so to do that, you need to actually go into N Dynamics, and under the N Hair menu, you need to go to the Create Hair option box, and then you need to figure out which one of the directions is basically your U direction or your V direction. An easy way to do that, which is basically X and Y, but X and Y are taken by the world space, so they use U and V for surface coordinates. You just select the cylinder, bring up your attribute editor. If you don't already have it open, you can press Control A to open it up, and you should get a tab. Okay, as soon as you open that, and you go to the tab that's labeled NURBS cylinder shape, and below that you can actually see what your spans are. So you get the spans UV, and you can see that U is 1, U is always first, and V is 20. So for the number of follicles, we're going to specify 20 in the V position. And what you can do is for your output, set it so that it just creates NURBS curves, because we're actually going to get rid of those in a moment. We only want to keep the follicles. Okay, so just apply that, close the window out, and then right away we basically get a follicle per every span on the surface. So basically we already have the beginnings of the tread here. We have most of the major parts. So now we just need to get rid of the curves, and we need to get rid of pretty much all the dynamic stuff. We just want to keep the follicles. So all you have to do is open up your outliner. You can do that by going to Window, Outliner, or just by clicking on the third button down in your Layouts menu within the toolbar. Okay, and so once you have it open, you're going to see something like basically like this. You'll see a hair system, you'll see your cylinder, and you'll see these groups containing the follicles and output curves. You basically want to get rid of the output curves directory and the hair system, and you can even get rid of the nucleus. Okay, that way you pretty much just have your NURBS cylinder and the attached follicles, which you can kind of see that little red mark in the middle. That's your follicle. So these are your follicles on it. Okay, and so basically we have our major parts for this. And to actually set up the motion of the individual follicles on the surface, you're going to have to actually edit, basically add an expression to the follicles. Now, one thing I like to do when I actually create follicles, I'll actually go in and I'll rename all of my follicles so that they essentially have a simple name, something I can easily type into an expression, so it's much shorter to type things out. So I usually select the first one, shift select the last one within the outliner, and then I go to the toolbar and I'll just do a quick rename. So I'll just call this one, let's say, Fol for follicle. And if you actually have multiple selected at once, what it'll do is it'll name them all Fol, but then number them sequentially. So I press enter, and as you can see, it's actually renamed all of the follicles 1 through 20, because there are 20 follicles, 1 per essentially span on the surface. So now what we need to do is I'm actually going to create an object, or what's something that's going to represent a tread plate for me. So let's say I'll use a cube. So I've got these little cube tools set up, and I'll just scale it down into a very basic tread plate. Okay? scale it down a little bit more, and then scale it out. Alright, so I've got a tread plate now. And I'm going to freeze it there. And when it comes to creating the tread plates, what I usually do is I'll actually duplicate special the tread so I get instances of them so that I can go back to the original, edit the original, and automatically updates all the plates. Just a little tip. But for now, I'll just take this one and I'll attach it to, let's say, follicle 1, for example. And so I'm going to select the tread plate and then Control or Command select the follicle from my outliner. And I'll just press P, and then I'll go to my channels box and I'll drag over the values of the translates and the rotates, and I'll set them all to 0. And so it actually snaps my plate into place. Okay? And you can always take your plate and you can change the orientation so that it lines up more with the surface. You can always wait and do that after you have all of your plates and all of your individual plates parented to the individual follicles, because then you can select them all at once and then rotate them all together. This way you update all their values at once, or you can just select all of them together and just type in the same value for the rotation if you know where it needs to go. So once you have your plate on the surface, then we can go to our follicle and we can go to your channels box and you'll see the parameters that control it. So in this case we have parameter U, which has it centered, 0.5, because basically UVs go from 0 to 1. That's the range for them, even around a surface. And so then we have parameter V, which is only at 0.025. And that's because out of the 20 follicles on the surface, that's the value of the position it's currently in. If I actually scrub the value from 0 to 1, you'll see it'll actually take our plate around the surface. Okay, so at this point, we need to get the follicle that our plate is attached to travel around the surface from beginning back to its original position. And since the surface has essentially a range of 0 to 1, we need it to recognize and actually drive around that range. So in order to set that value, we need to actually control the follicle, or basically where the follicle is attached. And you can do that by editing or adding expression to the follicle shape. One thing I want to do before we do that is I want to actually create a control object to essentially drive the motion. So let's say I create an arrow. Okay, and let's say that we're going to use this to drive the motion of our tread. So that if we actually have our tank, the tread will basically follow this arrow. And usually when it comes to setting up treads and tires, usually they only work if you actually drive in one consistent direction, and there are ways to set it up so that even if the vehicle turns, it'll still work. Okay, so now we actually have our control, and it's called arrow. And I'll go back to my follicle. So follicle 1, go to the follicle shape, and it's the parameter V we need to set the expression on. So I'm going to press Control or Command if you're on a Mac, right click on the parameter name and go to Expressions in the pop-up menu. Or what you can do is, while you have that parameter selected, just go to Window, Animation Editors, and load the Expressions Editor, and it should still load up your parameter, your attribute loaded in to the Select Object and Attribute input. So select your follicle shape, select the parameter V attribute, and then under Selected Object and Attribute, middle mouse click and drag that selected attribute down to your expressions work area. Now, the first value that we know is accurate is the existing or the default position, which is 0.025. And so you're going to have to basically make sure that that is in place for every single follicle before you move forward. And so that way we can already begin our expression. Pretty easy. And each follicle is going to have a different position. If you select follicle 2 and then look at its parameter V value, you can see that that is now 0.025. So it looks like it's a 0.05 increment. per follicle. So it's actually pretty easy to go through and continue that sequence as we create the expression. And you can always just quickly check it to see what it is and then go back to your expression. Now, as you notice, when we actually selected a different follicle, the expression vanished, but it's actually pretty easy to have it pop up again. Just go to select filter within the expressions editor window and choose by expression. And by expression will show the expression that you've already created. Okay? And that first expression, all I did was I typed in the follicle shape dot parameter v equals its default location, and then I told it to create, and it created the expression. Usually a good idea to give your expressions a very specific name. I like to do something like exp for expression underscore, and we'll just call this one drive. Okay, and I just edit that, click edit to update it. So now we need to basically set up the formula that's actually going to calculate the movement of our follicle from beginning to end based on our drive control. Okay, and right now my drive control is called arrow. So the expression is going to be fairly simple. So right before the default value, I'm going to put a parentheses, open and close, and let me just magnify this. Okay. Oh, it's not magnifying much. Now, in order to actually get our follicles to actually flow around the surface of our NURBS ribbon, we need to get the length of the ribbon from end to end. Okay, and in order to do that, we also need to make sure that no matter what size the ribbon is, it's always going to work. So we need something that's actually going to constantly keep track of the curved length. And so usually what I do is I'll actually create a node to handle that. And you only need one node because there's only one surface. So all you have to do is go to your node editor, window, node editor. Okay. As you can see, it loaded the follicle in. We don't really need that loaded in here. We're going to select that and then hit the garbage can to get rid of those nodes. Or you could do the eraser and it'll just clear the entire space, either one. And so now we need to create a node. We need to create a node to essentially measure the distance from one end of the surface to the other. Now if it was a curve, I would use a curve info node. But in this case, it is basically a surface, so we can't use a curve info because it actually won't recognize the information that we want, at least not from a surface. So what we need something to pay attention to the length, but for a three-dimensional object. So what we're going to do is hit tab, and I'm going to type in arc, and what we need is our arc length dimension node. Now essentially the arc length dimension node serves the same purpose as a curve info node, except that it checks a surface, not just a single curve. Okay, and now I'm going to expand the attributes. And so here we have arc length and we have arc length in V. And so we're going to actually need one of these values. We can use either one, it just depends on when we actually connect to everything. Usually it's going to be the arc length that we're going to use. Even though the attribute we're using is the V, it's usually the length around the surface. This usually comes out on the arc length attribute. So I need my surface loaded in here. So I need to select my surface. I'm going to make this window a little smaller. Select the surface. Come back to my node editor. And then I hit the little plus button, which is this one right here, which is add selected. Click it, and it'll add in our surface. And in each case, we're not going to be using the top level transform. The top level transform is always depicted as essentially a node with a slanted white square in it with a red arrow. So we're going to take the shape of our surface. We need to feed its world space attribute out. So I'm going to click on the white dot and hold, find world space and choose world space 0, and we need to feed it in to our arc length node. And we need to feed it into what's called the NURBS geometry attribute, which doesn't show up by default, so you need to actually drag and click over on the white dot, choose Other, and it'll bring up the input selection window. And if you actually scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see the NURBS geometry attribute, which is what we need. Click on it, and it'll make the connection. Okay, so once you have your NURBS ribbon's world space attribute hooked into your arc length dimension node shapes NURBS geometry attribute, then you need to actually do something within your Maya workspace. If you actually take a look, you can see that when I created that node, it actually created this new manipulator on the surface of the geometry, and notice it actually gives an L and then 0.0. The L represents length and the 0 is 0. Because basically when you create the node and you make the connection, by default the value it sets is 0 for the position of the measurement. So it's basically right now at 0, so it's not really measuring the full length, it's only at the beginning of the curve. So what you need to do is you need to actually drag it around to the other side. Now, one thing you could do if it was actually a very short surface, you could actually type in the value. And what you're going to type in the value for is again, the V, not the U, but the V of the surface. Okay? And in this case, it's actually 20, but it won't actually let me type in a 20 by default. So what I need to do is I can type in like a 9, but I can't type in double digits by default. It is sort of a limitation of the attribute initially. But what I can do is I can actually come in, notice it actually dragged it around a little bit relative to that 9 I put in. I can actually drag it all the way around and go a little further to the other side. Once I actually drag it around so it's actually showing double digits, then I can actually go in and type in 20. Because 20 is basically the total number of spans, and that's basically the total distance from 0 to 1 as well, 20 spans. So you need to type that in, but only once it allows you to put in double digits. So you actually have to drag it a little bit before it'll let you do that. Don't ask me why, it's just the way it works. Now, given that it's been essentially the V that's been giving us our value, or our value for going around the surface, then of course it's going to be the arc length V that you need to feed out to the expression. Okay? And so I actually just temporarily fed it. I temporarily fed it into the top level transform of our arc length node. So we could actually just take a look and see what the value actually is. So the value it's actually getting from the total length is 6.283. Okay? So that's not the number you're going to put in there. What we need to actually connect, so we need to actually connect the node into our expression. So just to make it a little easier to do that, I'm actually going to rename the node just to make it a little easier to type in. And so I usually do something like ALD underscore node, just so it shortens everything. It shortens the shape name and it shortens the transform name. So it's actually really easy to basically type the expression, keep it short and very specific all at the same time. So now that I have my ALD shape, and I know that I'm going to need the arc length in V as my attribute, then I need to go back to my expression. I can actually start setting it up so I can actually drive the object around the surface. Now, don't forget, you have a control that you should have created ahead of time, which I did. I created the arrow, and it's called arrow in my case. You may want to call it something like drive or something like that, just so you can. It doesn't matter as long as you put the name of it in there properly. So in this case, I've got my arrow, which is my drive control, and it's going to be moving in the Z axis. So you have to remember that. Translate Z is going to be the axis it's moving in. And so what I need to do is go to my expression that I have for my follicle, for the first one. And right before the default value that you actually get from the parameter U or V of the follicle, depending on the flow of the surface, you're going to actually type in open parentheses and close parentheses and then plus. Okay? Because what we're going to do is the value we're going to actually create here, we're going to actually have it basically being an additional value. It's going to add to the default. The default has to be there so that the follicle starts in the right place. place. So in this case, when we're driving the follicle around there, it's going to be the translation driving it. So when I put that in first. So in my case, it's going to be arrow, which is my driving control, and then dot, and then the name of the attribute that's going to be doing the driving around the surface. So you could type in TZ, which is the abbreviated version of translate Z, or translate capital Z if you actually write it out fully. And then that's going to be actually divided by our curve length, or in this case our arc length. So we're going to type in my node's name, which is AL capital D underscore node with capital N, and then it's the shape of it, so capital S HAPE, and then the attribute, which is going to be dot, because it's telling it that's going to be an attribute now. And usually these attributes are written lowercase for the first word, uppercase for the next, and then uppercase for the next after that, so that it automatically generates spaces. So it's going to be arc length in with a capital I, N, and then capital V. And so that should be accurate. And so once you have that, you can click on edit. And if you've typed the attribute correctly, it should be fine. If not, you'll get a little error. And so you need to make sure that you've typed in all of the shape names and the attribute names correctly. So I may have screwed up the arc length attribute name. Let me make sure. One way to check on that is you can select the node. I can go to the attribute editor, check the node itself. I'll select the shape. And instead of going to my node editor, I'm going to go Window, General Editors, and bring up the Connection Editor, which will actually allow me to see all of the attributes listed as they are within the node. And so arc length in V. So it looks like it's typed exactly as I did it, unless I misspelled something somewhere. Divided by, misspelled shape, put in an extra S. Okay, so as you can see, once I actually corrected that spelling error, which was shape was misspelled, I had an S there instead of an A. So once I actually clicked on edit, it actually took that TZ and expanded it so it said translate Z automatically. So it understood what I was trying to do. So now that one follicle should be able to flow over the surface, no problem. So let's take a look and see what that does. And I'm going to leave my arc length node just visible for now. Actually, you only need to use it once. So once you're actually done with it, you can go to the channels box and set visibility to 0. But you need to keep it, okay? So you can just set the visibility to 0, it'll hide it, and that's it. If I actually take my drive control now, and I translate it, you'll see that that follicle now tries to move all the way around the surface. And if I drag it far enough, it will go all the way back to 1. Okay? But as you can see, it also gets stuck at 1. And that's what we need to fix next. We need to make sure that the expression actually loops the action. Notice when I try to go to reverse, it's just stuck. And that's because the follicle can't actually go all the way around the surface, because a NURBS surface, even a NURBS curve, has a beginning and an end. Even if it's a circle, it's still actually a very specific shape. And so what we need to do in the expression is tell it to jump back to the beginning or back to the end when it actually hits that spot so that it looks continuous. Okay? And so there's actually a couple things you can do to help that happen. So first of all, we're going to take our expression here that we already have, and we're going to put it in another set of parentheses. So start parentheses and end parenthesis. Okay? And then we're going to add something. Let's add what's called a modulo. And usually a modulo is just basically the percentage sign. It's basically something that's used in math, so you can actually calculate the remainder of a number. And we're actually going to use that to help us make this expression cause that follicle to loop. Okay, so we're going to type in, after the last parentheses, we're going to type in %1. And we're going to put another parentheses around that at the beginning and the end. Okay, and put another %1. Once you do that, click Edit. Everything should be okay. And then let's check our expression. Okay, so now we go forward. And as you can see, forward, it jumps over and actually goes completely forward and actually passes over that hump. Notice it jumps from 0 back to 1 and continues. So it loops perfectly going forward. Now we need to make sure that it's actually going to loop in the negative when it's going in reverse. Okay? And in order to do that, it's actually really simple. We're going to go to the beginning of our expression, and right after the first parentheses, the first open, we're going to put in 1 minus. And then click Edit. Okay? So now we come back to our expression, and we'll try to go in reverse again. Okay, so now as you can see, going in both directions, it's actually looping perfectly now. So now I bet some of you are saying, but it's moving in the wrong direction. Well, you have to remember, it's moving relative to the flow of the surface. So if it's actually moving in the wrong direction, all you have to do is take the surface, go to its rotate Y, rotate it 180 degrees, so it basically flips the direction of the surface, and then you can freeze transform it. So that when you actually take your control then, and you move it, it'll be moving in the appropriate direction. Okay, so now that we know the expression works, we need to make sure that we assign the same expression to each follicle, but we need to make sure that expression is pointing to that new follicle, and it's actually using that other follicle's default. All the follicles are going to have their own default positions, so we need to make sure that that's going to be in each one of our expressions. So you can do this one of two ways. You can either sit down and make a list of what all the values are, or you can just calculate it. It's actually pretty easy. Since it's actually basically 1 divided by 20, you can just figure out what the value is going to be per increment. Or you can simply go in and check each follicle before you actually add the new expression in. So in this case, we need to add the expression for follicle number 2, and we need its follicle shape value. So you select follicle 2 in your outliner, like I'm doing here. Make sure your challenge box is visible so you can see the value, and you see that's 0.075. And so I can go to my first line, put in a semicolon, press enter, and I'm going to copy my first line, copy, paste it in, and I'm going to put in my new default, which is 0.075, and I'm going to change the name of the follicle it's pointing to, which in this case is follicle number 2, and then I choose edit, and it's just that simple. Okay, so now when I come in and I drag my drive, if you actually look very close, you can see that follicle 2 is actually moving. So we have follicle 2 and follicle 1 moving now. Okay, and they're staying an equal distance apart because they're both trying to stay at their default positions, plus the change that's occurring in the translation of our drive control. Okay. So basically, again, you're going to select the next follicle. So in this case, follicle 3. Go to the next line. And make sure you have a semicolon at the end of every line so that Maya knows that you're talking about the value for something else or a calculation for the next element. And you paste the line in again, and this time it's going to be follicle shape 3. Okay? And I can still see my channel box, as you can see here. And in this case, my parameter V is 0.125. So I come down to my default value at the end here, and I put in 0.125. And you just keep doing that until you have the expressions in for every single follicle. So this is pretty much the most tedious part of it, unless you're able to write an ML script or a Python script that generates all these values for you and plugs them in. Okay, so it took me about 5 minutes to basically go through and create the 20 different expressions. So if you have, let's say, 40 tread plates, it might take you 10 minutes depending on how quick you are and how complicated the increment is. My increment was fairly simple. It was basically a 0.05 increment, so it was easy to just add 0.05 every time. Basically, mine starts from 0.025 and it goes to 0.975. And so now I have all the follicles in place. Now the last part, which is probably going to take a little longer, it's not particularly tedious, just a lot of things to do. Then you have to go in and basically make duplicates of your plate. So usually, like I said, what I'll do is I'll go to Edit, and I'll go to Duplicate Special, Option Box, bring my Duplicate Special window, and I'm going to duplicate into the world, and it's usually going to be an instance. So it's not duplicating the graph, it's just going to do an instance of the object into the world space. And if you, let's say, have 20 that you need, and you already have one duplicate, or maybe even one original, just depends on how you want to do it, you can, let's say, make 19 other copies and just duplicate special, and it'll make the other copies. Now, once you have your own copies, then you can go through and start connecting them into the remaining follicles. So you can select one, and then Control select the next follicle, press P, and it'll connect it into it. Go to your channels box and make sure you set the translates and the 0 and the rotate values to 0, so it actually aligns it with your follicle. And you just do that until you have all of your plates in place. Now, one thing which might make the process go a little faster, if you're not a scripter and you can't make a script, which would be fairly simple in this case, but if you're not a scripter, all you have to do is you can go through and do the parenting first. Okay, so I've already got one parented to follicle number 1 and 2, so I'll select it. I'll go to follicle 3 and parent, and this one's going to follicle 4 and P for parent, follicle 5, P for parent, follicle 6, P for parent, follicle 7, P for parent, follicle 8, P for parent, follicle 9, P for parent. And notice in each case, I'm just selecting the plate, and I'm pressing Control or Command depending on your operating system, and I'm just basically selecting the next follicle that needs to receive them, pressing P to parent it to it. And what it's doing is it's changing it in the hierarchy. It still hasn't really moved in location yet, but it is connected to the right element. And that took less time than editing the expressions. So now we have all of our follicles in place. All of our parts in place, and the follicles have the expressions on them. Now we need to make sure that all of our plates line up properly with the follicles. So what you can do is you can select your plates within the world space, and then while they're all selected at once, all of your plates, then you can go to the value in the channels box, select over the translate and the rotate values, and then just type 0 and press enter. And it'll equally distribute all of your plates all the way around. And at that time, if you want to adjust the plates so that their rotation is a little more aligned relative to the surface itself, you can just rotate them. I'll rotate all of them the same amount at the same time because you have them all selected. And they're all rotating relative to their own pivot points. Okay? So at that point, you pretty much have your basic tread in place. All you have to do now is reshape the ribbon. And so if I actually drag my driver, which is my arrow in this case, you can see that now the plates are sliding along the surface in both directions, no problem. Now you can also, if you just want to make it look nice, you can select the ribbon at the same time. So it looks like it's actually rotating. But as you can see, the ribbon itself is not rotating. It's actually just the follicles sliding along the surface. Okay? And like I said, you can either use a lattice. So you can go to Create Deformers, create a lattice around the ribbon, not the bricks, just the ribbon. And then you can actually use the lattice. I like to create at least 4 spans. So I have a good amount of control, but not too much control over the overall shape, so I can actually quickly make adjustments to change the entire thing. And as I said before, you need to be very, very careful when you're making the changes so that you're not basically pushing the bricks too close together. And this will be true even if you were just directly manipulating the ribbon. Okay, and this is so that you actually get the shape that you need. And changing the shape won't affect how the bricks or how the plates actually flow around the surface. They'll just change the overall path of that flow. So as you can see, I reshaped it, no problem. And now if I actually take my drive, it still flows around it, no problem. And so that's how you actually create a ribbon version of a tread. And you don't need to worry about anything going wrong if you actually translate from left to right. So if I actually translate this from left to right, and I think I can even do it without the lattice. Although when you actually apply the lattice, make sure that the lattice you're using, if you are going to use a lattice, make sure you go to the option box and set the lattice so that it's actually transforming all points. So that even when the shape is outside of the lattice, it'll still maintain the same shape. So finally, if you have your tread and you need actually a second one, it's actually really easy to duplicate it without actually having to rebuild it again. All you have to do is you select the elements of your ribbon. In this case, we select our ribbon, the NURBS ribbon. We select our follicles in their group, because they will automatically be created inside of a group. And you select your arrow. And if you want to, you could even select the arc length node. So you select all of those elements, and then you can just go to Edit. You can do a Duplicate Special option box, and under Duplicate Special, you're going to group Underworld, of course, and then you're going to come down and tell it to Duplicate Input Graph. And you do the Duplicate Special, you might get a little error, and that's because it might see that you have multiple copies of the same name. But if you click, you can see that everything is connected. And if we actually nudge our ribbon and our second arrow to the side, you see that we actually have two treads now. Okay, so you could have a left and a right, each one with its own driver. So you could have separate drivers, so you could drive each tread individually. If you only want one driver, you could just go in and quickly do something like take the first one, constrain the second one to it, so like a parent constraint or something like that. Or even just go back into the expression and reassign the driver. And basically it'll drive both of them. Now, what actually inspired this tutorial was the fact that I was basically going through and trying to create little tools to work with curves. So I do a lot of things with curves in rigs and modeling, and just trying to figure out different ways to make controls and things like that. So I actually created a little script that contains a bunch of my favorite tools, like favorite NURBS objects, and some tools I'm still adding to the list. But what I can do here is that I can quickly make the kind of treads I want. Basically, I wrote a little script that generates either the NURBS curve or the ribbon version of the tread setup, and it'll even work with more linear types of curves as well, at least for assigning things to the curve path. So I can create a circle here. I don't even need to put it in the right position. I'll create an object that I'm going to use as a tread piece. Let's say I'll use a box like I did for the demo. Okay, I'll scale it down. Make sure you freeze transform everything. So everything's frozen, everything's default. I select the tread piece first. I select the path that it's going to be on. And I can do multiple paths as well, so not just the one. And click on tread path. I can specify a name for the control. If I wanted to, I could even use the original tread piece as my controller if I wanted to. So by default, it's called cube when it's generated, so I'll tell it to use cube. And I'll set it, and then I'll tell it how many plates to use, so 24. Set that, and then I tell it what kind of curve it is. In this case, it's a spline curve, so I'm going to tell it to use spline. And it basically generates all the plates, it makes all the connections, it even creates a little locator here to stabilize things. If I translate it, you can see that it'll actually affect my cubes. And if I actually take my box now, when I translate that, you can see that it rotates my tread. So it's very cool. Okay, works just fine, no problems. And I can even do the same thing if I wanted to generate one using a ribbon. So again, I take the cube, shift select my path, tread path. I'll use the actual default control. Put in 24 and I'll tell it ribbon this time. And since the curve is actually laying flat on the grid, it needs to extrude along the Y, so up and down. So it creates my, notice it creates my ribbon, it centers it on where the path was, it deletes the original path, and so now I have my control object, and as you can see, my tread works fine. And I can even take it, rotate it my 90 degrees, freeze it, and take my control again, pull along, and it still works just fine. Okay. So this tool, I'm probably going to put it up on Creative Crash. Once it's actually done, I'm pretty much just going through and error checking it and things like that. So I may put it up for free for a while, or maybe charge $1 for it or something. We'll see.